Why should we not lay up treasures on this
Bring
earth?
all the tithe to the store.
For we brought nothing into the world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. No one can serve two masters. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He who loves silver will not be satisfied. Earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, even the people. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil.
Hello and welcome to Faith and Finance. In this program, we're going to be talking about an unusual topic for many people, inheritance and estate planning. People really want to put this off, thinking if they make a will, they're going to die sooner. You really don't die sooner, you just die prepared. But in addition, estate planning covers all of life. But I will warn you ahead of time, many of the programs that you've seen of Faith and Finance in the past, you say, I already knew that. It's just kind of a refresher for me to understand that. But in this particular one, it will cause you to think because it's out of harmony, typically biblical principles, in this case, out of harmony with what many people practice in America. We're talking about Faith and Finance, and this is a book that you can purchase through the Adventist Book Center at the number you can see on your screen, 170-page book that has 12 lessons in it. I think you'll find it very helpful as a companion. We also have in Spanish, Fe y Finanzas, available at the same location, and I hope that it will be a blessing to those who prefer in the Spanish language. When we talk about inheritance, there are a number of Bible verses that mention this. Ecclesiastes 2:21 says, For there is a man whose labor and is with wisdom and skill and knowledge, and yet he must leave it to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. So your estate consists of everything you own. As you grow older, the emphasis in your financial planning will shift from accumulating and preserving to distributing them. And we're going to talk about how to do that. Estate planning includes wills and trusts and is useful for both rich and poor. But trusts not only provide tax advantages, but can also be used to choose a guardian for minor children and to avoid family squabbles after a person passes away. So just what is estate planning? Estate planning is not just what you do with what you have when you're dead, but estate planning is a definite plan for the administration and disposition of one's property during your life and also at one's death. So it involves both handling one's property while the person is alive and also dealing with the property a person still owns at the time of their death. There are really two components to estate planning. One is building the estate, and that is through working, through purchases, through saving, through investments and insurance and so on. And then the second part is transferring the assets to the person's desired location or destination, if you please. There are some common misconceptions about estate planning. And some people think, well, it's only dealing with what you have when you die. But the reality is estate planning encompasses the accumulation, the conservation, and the distribution of the estate that you have. So the overall purpose of estate planning process is to develop a plan that will enhance and maintain the financial security of the person and his family. And this one is very important to understand. So estate planning should provide financial security during retirement and facilitate the intended and orderly disposition of the property at death. We all understand that we didn't bring anything into the world and we're not taking anything out with us, so it has to be distributed when a person dies. But remember, I've included, it's not just facilitating this orderly disposition, but it's also making sure there's financial security during the time of retirement. Actually, your estate plan is the crowning act of your stewardship. It's what you do with what you've accumulated during your lifetime. It's interesting to recognize that since God is the owner of everything, as we're told in Psalms 24, verse 1, therefore it's logical to conclude from a biblical perspective that I should return to Him what is left in my estate when I no longer have need of it and my family is taken care of. So there's an interesting proverb in Proverbs 20 and verse 21, an inheritance gained hastily at the beginning will not be blessed at the end. Now, what does this actually mean? It means that most people would be better off earning what they get rather than just getting it as a gift. So preparing our children to be effective and productive citizens in society, and through receiving, instead of receiving an inheritance, is probably better to give them some money when they're needing it in education and not just when a person dies. It's very important to understand that if a person has not created an estate plan and executed the appropriate documents to implement their wishes, a plan has been created for you by the state in which you reside. So nobody really dies without a will. You either have one that you've prepared where your needs are taken care of and your family is as you would want them to, or there's one that the state will create for you using the laws of descent and distribution and the laws of intestacy of the state in which you reside. But it's interesting also that without a properly drafted and endorsed will, a person cannot leave property to a church or charity. Listen, if you die without a will, the state who makes your will then assumes that you are an atheist. In no way would any of your assets ever be returned to God through a church or charity. You cannot, the state does not recognize a friend, a non-relative, to inherit your property also. Maybe you have a close friend that you'd like to give some item to. Unless you've put that in a will, it's not going to happen through one that the state provides for you. So if no relative exists by virtue of the state will that they prepare for you, your property would revert to the state, or as we say in the law, it would escheat to the state. And so if you don't have any living relatives when you die, the property goes to the state and may fill potholes on the interstate, who knows. But anyone who dies without a will, intestate, appears really to have no concern for their property, their family in the way they would want to distribute, and certainly not God or the church. So let's talk about the estate planning process. It's very interesting, really. You can understand that if you plan properly, it's not just a happenstance thing, but it can be prepared ahead of time, and that way it will not leave your loved ones in a lurch should you pass away. So your estate planning concerns can be divided into these important areas. And I want to stress them, just like I've talked to you about 3 areas of your life: your learning years, your earning years, and your returning years. There's 3 things you need to remember when you're talking about estate planning. The first thing is for the needs that you will have and your spouse for the balance of your life. We call that financial independence, to make sure that you have an income stream as you do when you plan for your retirement. The second one is the needs of any family members, and that would be called your family legacy. And this is particularly true during the time of your life when you have minor children who really could not provide for themselves and do not have a proper education to be able to be independent on their own. And then finally is the spiritual legacy, what is returned to God. So your needs, the needs of your family, and what you'll return to God are the things that you would want to think about. So we'll look at those in turn. When we talk about financial independence, we're talking about having the needs taken care of, an income stream sufficient to meet the needs that you would expect to have during your retirement time. Financial independence is the foundation of our estate plan. We cannot give everything away because we must keep something to live on and to provide for our own needs during this period of time. The next one is family legacy. And when we look at family legacy, we're thinking about anybody who's dependent upon us for their income. The area has the most emotion associated with it. This is especially true here in America, where people grow up with the notion that when their parents die, they, the children, should receive their parents' assets divided equally among siblings. Obviously, this is something that we've come to understand here, and I believe that provision should be made for those who are still dependent on the parents for at least part of their food, clothing, shelter, or their education. But parents' primary goal in life is to teach their children to become independent adults and good citizens. The plan that we have followed in our family In fact, we discussed it with our children, and I said to them, I'm planning to live to be 95 at least, and so I said to them, would you like your inheritance when I'm 95 and you're 60, in your 60s, or would you rather have it when you graduate from college and you could use it for graduate education or as a down payment on a house or something like that? Well, it's not difficult to think what they chose. They chose to get it then. In fact, my son told me one time, Dad, I feel I'm better off with you alive than dead, because I know you've given me my inheritance already, and you continue to give me gifts and do good things for me, but when I die, most of your stuff is returning to God based on the plan that we decided on many years ago. So you can understand that grown children, for them, many financial counselors and others say there is evidence on both sides regarding leaving money and assets to grown children. So we're going to take a few minutes to look at some of these. One of them is the memory text that we talked about at the beginning, which is Ecclesiastes 2:21. For here is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage or portion to a man who has not labored for it. And the Bible says this also is vanity and a great evil. So it talks about giving money to people who haven't earned it is not a good idea. And yet there's another proverb that says, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. So how do we actually justify or put these two together? There's apparently a conflict that we need to resolve. And I think that we can do that by recognizing a simple principle from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, passing ownership of land to descendants was vital. Without it, succeeding generations couldn't farm the land or raise livestock. So in those days, they gave property so that children could become independent adults. But today, of course, we live in quite a different society. Inheritances are usually windfalls going to career people who live separately from their parents and who are financially independent and typically better off than their parents. So what should we do? It would seem appropriate under these circumstances to pass on businesses to children who are depending on them and who will continue to operate them. But for most people, getting an education would be very, very valuable, and that's what I encourage. The Bible says in Proverbs 22, verse 1, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. Could it be that values are really the best legacy that we could leave our children? For example, values passed on by parents to children, ethical values of honesty and justice and fairness, personal values like modesty and loyalty and faithfulness, and of course emotional values like being compassionate or kind or generous. Those things can be passed on. There are other values like good citizenship, financial responsibility, frugality, good stewardship, faith in God, spiritual commitment, punctuality, competence, good health, care for others, time with family, and love for education and self-improvement. These are the kind of things. Scott Fithian wrote a book called Value-Based Estate Planning, and he stated in his book, leaving no money but passing on values to heirs is acceptable. They will likely manage very well on their own if we've given them those values. But leaving money to heirs who have been poorly developed values, as far as money values is concerned, is really asking for trouble. We're told that the very best legacy that parents can leave their children is a knowledge of useful labor and the example of a life characterized by disinterested benevolence, or that is helping others and helping to advance God's cause. By such a life, they show the true value of money, that it is really only to be appreciated for the good that it will accomplish in relieving their own wants, the necessities of others, and of course, in advancing the cause of God. Now, it's interesting that the responsibility, we're told, to entrust God's resources to children should only take place if they have demonstrated that they have the ability to handle those resources in a manner that would be pleasing to God, who is the owner of all. And Ron Blue, in his book Splitting Heirs, stated, the fact that because you have a child should not make that child the automatic beneficiary of your estate. And Ron goes on to say, you are a steward of God's resources on His behalf. You're not a steward of your children's resources, and you're not accountable to your children about how you transfer or spend God's money. You are accountable to God. So we understand that if parents would, while they live, would assist their children to help themselves, like getting an education, it would be better than to leave them a large amount when they die. In fact, we know that children who are left to rely principally upon their own exertions make better men and women and are better fitted for practical life than those children who have depended on their parents and their father's estate. So let's look now at the spiritual legacy, and then we'll try to figure out how to do some of these things. The spiritual legacy is the part that we return to God after our needs are met and after any of our children's needs are met. Remember that once the children are independent adults, we can turn more to the spiritual legacy. Unless our children are afflicted or somehow disabled and are not able to work, we want to train them to become independent adults, and then we can go to the spiritual legacy. The great philanthropist R.G. Letourneau, who started the great earth-moving equipment business many years ago, he was a businessman and entrepreneur, and a great philanthropist, stated, "The question is not how much of my money I give to God, but rather how much of God's money I keep for myself." So you can understand that it's important to have that concept in mind that God is the owner and we're the manager. Most people, and this is one of the great ironies of life really, is most people spend 2/3 of their lives accumulating their assets, and when they finally reach retirement age with a comfortable nest egg, financial advisors like me start talking to them about how they should give it all away. Because you're not going to take anything with you, that's really important to know. People who spend their lives with their estate plan have to begin to think they've taken a lifetime to accumulate these assets, and 100% of their estates can be given to charity and have minimum problems when they pass away, tax consequences or anything. But be sure that your first two things are taken care of first. Now, on the contrary, on the idea of the estate, it's an idea that we understand how much we should return to God, and a decision has to be made when and how this will be done. And that's how we're talking about, I would suggest, if you can, once your needs are taken care of and your children's needs are taken care of, and then you can start giving away while you're living. There's an interesting statement that says if you do your giving while you're living, then you're knowing where it's going. It's not necessarily true that even if you have a will, that your estate will go where you've desired. For example, the great hotel heiress Leona Helmsley, who died a couple of years ago, she left $12 million to her pet dog. And I don't know how a dog would ever need all of that, but the fact is that was what happened. 2 years after her death, a federal judge overruled the estate and left only $2 million to the dog and gave $10 million to one of her other favorite charities. So I can just tell you, if you do present giving, the donor can see the results of the gift. The ministry or person that benefits from it now when their needs are greatest. Another one is it prevents arguing among family members after a person's death. And by the way, that's one reason that families argue after estate planning. And it's really sad, because if you do the giving while you're living and while you have your wits about you, then there's really hardly any argument about it. There are a couple of other ideas that I'll share. One of them is any of the advantages of giving while we're still alive, is it sets a good example of family values, of generosity and love for others. It also minimizes estate tax consequences, and it guarantees that the gift will go to the desired entity, which, as I told you, doesn't always happen. Another point is it demonstrates the donor's Christ-like motivation. In other words, basically, without Christ, you're a selfish person and you think about yourself. With Christ, you should be gradually being transformed from selfishness to loving. And then finally, in these motivations to give while still living, it stores up treasure in heaven. And we can understand how valuable that is. Ron Blue stated in his book, Splitting Heirs, "It's my own belief that you get no eternal reward for assets given at death. You don't have any choice. You're leaving it all anyway. How can you receive a reward for something you kept your entire life and were forced to give only at death? God will reward you later for your sacrifices now, but if your faith is shown now and your unselfishness is exhibited in this life. We're also told those who neglect known duty by not answering God's claims upon them in this life and who soothe their consciences by calculating on making some bequest at death will receive no words of condemnation from the Master, nor will they receive a reward. So it's important that we understand Christian financial perspectives in this topic of estate planning as well. Gaining the knowledge of God's will in money management and becoming financially faithful is one of the greatest benefits listening to these programs and studying the lessons in the book. It's interesting that people complain to me that the church talks too much about money. I think the reason they do that is they don't understand God's ownership and they don't understand our stewardship. How we manage God's money is so important that He inspired Bible writers to talk about this topic more than any other, like 4 times more than any other. This is really an amazing. So what are some of the options that we could think about for spiritual legacy? We can talk about a few of those. I would suggest things like there are hundreds of causes that we could support with our charitable intentions, spiritual legacy funds. And one of the things that once our tithe has been taken care of, the offerings, this is what our charitable gift would be discretionary to the giver. So you could do whatever you wanted to with it. But the Bible says in part of our Great Commission, you shall receive power. This is the book of Acts chapter 1 verse 8. After the Holy Ghost has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses unto me in both Jerusalem and in all Judea and in Samaria and to the uttermost part of the earth. Now the reason I mention that, there's 4 places here, right around where we live, a little farther out from us, in a big pictures like to a church organization, and to the whole world. So it's a big picture. Probably we should try to help in every area if we can. So we can find guidance in these areas strictly from the Bible as well. Jesus told the rich young ruler that by helping others, especially the poor, we store up treasures in heaven and become one of His disciples doing that. So I suggest to people some different ideas. For example, gospel ministry. You can help various other ministries. There's lots of ministries available to help. Christian education, providing education for someone who could not afford to do it on their own. You could also help to build a new church or leave it to your local church if there's a mortgage on it that would help to be paid off. The Bible is very clear from Revelation, the 14th chapter, and I believe it's verse 13, that says, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Yea, from henceforth they rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." Your estate plan given through charitable organizations can continue to work after we pass away. Another one is you can support schools and clinics and orphanages. And there are people all over the earth, and especially if you travel abroad, you can see how much help is needed. You can sponsor a young person on a mission trip or something like that. There's many other things that we could talk about. I want to address the topic of a will. Why should we have a will? Well, a will protects against untimely death, lack of testamentary capacity, and takes care of what has been not returned to God before a person dies. Now, I mentioned the term testamentary capacity, so I want to talk about that just briefly. Testamentary capacity means that you have your wits about you, you know what your assets are, you know who your children are, you know what your debts are, you know what you'd like to do. You understand that it is possible to be alive today and not have testamentary capacity. If you're confused and you have dementia or whatever, you might still be pretty much healthy physically, but you couldn't make a will. So a will is a legal instrument whereby a person makes disposition of his or her property to take effect at the time of death. And a will is a valid instrument and is a good beginning point for an estate plan. The will should be reviewed periodically to ensure that the property owner's most recent intentions are honored at death. Now we obviously should not just have a will that we made when we were in our 20s, but there are common reasons for revising an estate plan or updating your will, for example. A number of things come to mind. Birth or adoption of children, divorce or death of a spouse. You might move to another state, or you might be a change in your assets that you possess. any of these things would be a good idea to update your will. Kathy and I recently updated our entire estate plan because we were planning to travel to a place that wasn't really safe. Obviously, we have faith in God, but the fact is, should something happen to us, we want to make sure that everything is current. And by the way, attorneys now have their computers in their office, and you can update your will fairly inexpensively, and it would be valuable to do. If you don't have a will, certainly you'd want to get one, especially if you have minor children. Now there's some additional estate planning documents that we'll talk about. One of them, of course, is a living will, which allows you to decide, it's a document that you can use to print out in advance the type of care that you would want to receive if you were to become permanently unconscious or terminally ill and unable to communicate. This would be a health care power of attorney or a living will. There have been cases recently where people did not have those, and they were kept alive for years and years with, feeding tubes and all of that, with no quality of life and so on, no brain waves and so on. If you don't want that to happen to you, you need a living will. This is very important. There's another thing called an advance directive that's very similar, but in general terms, it refers to a person's verbal or written instructions about future medical care in the event the person becomes unable to speak for himself. Other things that I would talk about are a living will and so on, and I want to mention the durable power of attorney. Typically, husband and wife can exercise these to each other so that whichever one loses their testamentary capacity to begin with, or their ability to know, the other person can be the one to make decisions for both of them. But a durable power of attorney is when you call another person to be your agent or your attorney in fact. That person who signs or executes a power of attorney is called the principal. Now, a durable power of attorney enables the agent to act for the principal even after the principal is not mentally competent or physically able to make his own decisions. The durable power of attorney must be used immediately, or can be used, may be used in that way, and is effective until it's revoked by the principal or until the principal dies. And then, of course, his estate plan, his testamentary documents would come into play. Now, I want to tell you something interesting about a power of attorney. Appoint a trustworthy person as your agent. It's very critical. Without a trustworthy agent, a power of attorney becomes a dangerous legal instrument and could be a threat to the principal's best interests. So you wouldn't want to see that happen. Protect yourself. Make it clear to your agent that you want accurate records kept of all transactions that will be completed on your behalf, and request there be a periodic accounting to a court or to some agent that you also represent. Direct your agent to provide an accounting to a third party, could be a family member or a trusted friend, and so on. Remember that our real ultimate goal in this life is to follow God's counsel, to store up treasures in heaven, and not to accumulate stuff that was going to get burned up here at the end. So we're talking about storing up treasures in heaven, and it would be very, very valuable to recognize that we can do that by helping others and helping advance the cause of God. Your estate plan is the crowning act of your stewardship and should be done carefully and thoroughly and with the counsel of a qualified attorney. And I would say that God will bless you and give you wisdom if you do that. You're not going to die any sooner. You just die prepared. May God bless you as you look into this in your life, and may it be a blessing to you as well.